Hi, everyone. It's a true delight today to welcome Dr. Jill Carnahan to the Joy Prescription Podcast. Dr. Jill is a board-certified family physician, and she's also certified in Integrative Holistic Medicine. She's the founder and medical director of Flatiron Functional Medicine in Louisville, Colorado. I had to look up how to say that. You want to say Louisville in Louisville, Colorado. Dr. Jill's clinic is widely sought after with a broad range of clinical services, including functional medicine consulting, chiropractic therapy, physical therapy, naturopathic medicine, acupuncture, and therapeutic massage. And Dr. Jill is not only a functional medicine expert, but she's also been a patient herself multiple times over the years. She's a survivor of breast cancer, Crohn's disease, and toxic mold illness. So she brings a very unique perspective as a physician. And I know you don't want me to read all your bio, Jill, but I think it's worthwhile because it's very impressive. Dr. Jill has been featured in People magazine, Shape, Parade, Forbes, Mind, Body, Green, First for Women, the Townsend Newsletter, and the Huffington Post. And she's been seen on NBC News and health segments with Joan London. And her YouTube channel and podcast features experts from all over the world in functional medicine and science. She's co-authored the textbook with Dr. Mark Houston, Personalized and Precision Integrative Cardiovascular Medicine. And she's recently authored this book, a prescriptive memoir. It's titled Unexpected: Finding Resilience Through Functional Medicine, Science, and Faith. Four of my very favorite topics in the whole world. So we certainly have a lot in common, Dr. Jill, and I've thoroughly enjoyed reading your memoir. It was particularly moving for me, given the fact that we went to medical school together at Loyola University of Chicago way back in the late 90s. And, I watched you go through your breast cancer journey just with such grace. And I followed your illustrious career over the years here. So just welcome. I'm so thrilled that you're here. Welcome.
Well, Cindy, it's a pleasure. And I know to everybody out there, you're Dr. Liebert, but because you and I go way back, it's like that precious to be able to call you Cindy. And I want to tell you, it is such an honor and a privilege to be here because of the fact that 20 plus years ago, we spent our lives through medical school. And that was a lot of the start of my other education outside of medical school on healing. And again, just for you to have witnessed that a little bit, it's extra special. And the fact that we share a very common deep faith, it is an absolute delight to be here with you.
Well, feeling is mutual. So let's talk about your book. And I just finished it last night. I've been savoring it. It's so beautiful. And you definitely had an amazing journey, both as a physician, a woman, and a patient. And so your journey has been just really lots of staggering health challenges and some personal challenges as well. If you would just get us started sharing a little bit about your personal journey with breast cancer in your early 20s and how that experience shaped your perspective on health and healing.
Yeah, so I grew up on a farm in Illinois. I was one of 5 children. My mother was a retired nurse who just retired to take care of her 5 children. And a beautiful family, like an idyllic kind of Norman Rockwell-esque background, because we had like acres of land and we'd play on the 4-wheelers and be outside. And I was the oldest girl. I had an older brother, and then I had 3 younger siblings, and 2 of them, it was kind of like the 3 older ones and then a little 7-year space, and then the younger ones. So I ended up being a big sister, babysitter, took care of my youngest siblings. So I had a lot of responsibility on the farm, and again, lots of beautiful things. But in hindsight, when I was diagnosed at 25 in the midst of my 3rd year, and you remember 3rd year medical, it was brutal, right? And we were right before work hour regulations. So that was still like not a lot of stipulation on how many hours. I mean, I remember doing like 36-hour shifts and post call and all that stuff. And what I didn't realize then was a couple things. Number one, I was this highly sensitive person, which I think in hindsight makes a great physician because I'm super empathetic. I'm very in tune with the patients and I can sometimes feel their emotions and those things. But in medical school, it makes for a very rough go because when you're sensitive, it's a brutal environment. And I almost want to cry for that girl back then, myself in my 20s going through that education. It was wonderful. And we had a great class, we had amazing people and even our professors, and it was a good learning environment in some ways. But in some ways, the system of medical training is still very brutal and there's not a lot of kindness and compassion. And I remember how like to hold your bladder and to not eat and to not sleep was like, those things were lauded if you could put aside your actual physical needs and show up. And like, that was how we were trained. And again, it makes for great doctors or surgeons or, those kinds of things, but it doesn't make for a very compassionate person because if we are denying our own need to urinate or to eat food or to sleep, like then we go into life being kind of dissociated from our bodies. And then it's much harder to help our patients heal because part of healing is actually getting back in touch with ourselves and what are our needs and how do we show up in that, taking care of those. But all that to say, 25 out of the blue, I got a lump in my breast right after my surgical rotation. I would have told you it was nothing. Like I did not think anything of it, but I was married at the time. My husband said, Jill, you need to take this seriously. So of course I got a biopsy and I got a call from the surgeon just a week or so after. And she said, "Is Dr. Smith?" Remember? And she said,
Yeah.
she said, Jill, I don't know how to tell you. I mean, I'll never forget that moment. And
Goodness.
any of you out there who've had like life-changing death of a family member, you remember where you were sitting, the color of the walls, maybe the song that was playing, like that memory is imprinted forever in your mind. And this moment, I'll never forget where I was sitting, how I felt, because I remember the blood just like pooling from my brain down to my limbs and being like, this is unbelievable. This can't be real. Like how in the world? I'm 25. And I don't know if you knew this, Cindy, but at Loyola at that time, now since then there's been so many young people diagnosed with breast cancer, but at that moment, I was the youngest one ever diagnosed at Loyola.
Goodness gracious.
So it was a huge big deal for even for the staff and the doctors and everybody. Everyone was like, oh my goodness, this is crazy, right? Now, sadly, again, we've seen a lot of 20s and even some teens with breast cancer. And as you know, and most of your listeners might know, this in a 20-something is a whole different disease than in a 55, 65-year-old woman. So I was dealing with an incredibly aggressive cancer that was rapidly dividing fat, like everything about the tumor that you could say was aggressive, it was there. And so I was faced with all of a sudden, I went into medicine knowing that there was natural ways of healing. And I didn't even know about functional medicine there, but I grew up on a farm with organic food and like knowing that food was important to our life. And I had some principles there, but all of a sudden, boom, I come face to face with cancer and like, what am I going to do? And I'm 25. So I made a choice. And I've never regretted that choice. And I always recommend to patients or practitioners, when you have these difficult choices, take all the data, take your time, make a decision, but don't ever say, what if I would have done it differently? Because that regret will chew you up, right?
Totally good advice.
Yeah, and it's so important. And I remember at that time having the insight to be like, okay, this is a hard decision, but whatever I decide, I'm never going to say whether I live or die, whether I have sequelae from treatments. And what happened was I ended up doing almost everything they recommended in the most aggressive way. So I had 3-drug chemotherapy for 6 cycles, including basically cardio, almost to the limit of cardiotoxic doses of doxorubicin, and immune toxic doses of Cytoxan and all the whole works. And then after that, radiation and multiple surgeries to get margins. So I had everything they threw at me. And I came out of that about 9 months later. You probably remember I took a leave of absence from school during that. And it's so funny, Cindy, when I first got diagnosed, I was like, oh, no one will know. I'll just keep working and I'll just get the chemo on the side. And well, Jill, because I was so sick and I was bald and there was no way I was going to keep working. But in my mind, it's like, oh, I'm fine. No one will ever know this. But that did not happen. I was incredibly ill. And now in hindsight, we know one of the drugs, Cytoxan, actually creates a more permeable gut. One of its mechanisms at getting at the immune system to create a more aggressive immune system to fight the cancer is through an increased permeability. I didn't know any of this, but in hindsight, I get out 9 months later, my cancer is in remission, supposedly gone, at least for the time being. And I was sick. My gut was destroyed. I was exhausted. I had brain fog. I had no hair. But all I had known was growing up on the farm, being tough, showing up, don't complain, like the kind of mentality that farm kids have, right? And so I didn't have this idea that I could take care of myself, or that I could even take a little extra time to heal. Like I went right back into rotations.
Yeah.
I didn't
Mhm.
tell anyone how sick I was. And again, I don't think you even know, or any of my
I
friends.
didn't know. You seem to just sail through it.
But it was so sick. And I remember, I think my first or second rotation back was in the emergency room. So we do this like 12-hour shifts. And I was running fevers up to 102 almost every shift.
Goodness,
Whoa.
goodness
I was
gracious.
so sick. And again, I just kind of was like, oh, this is just part of the healing. And I was afraid to tell my attending, because I thought, oh my gosh, I've just taken 9 months off. I can't. And this is where the change from the mentality of I have to be strong, I can't be weak. That was a pattern that I was given as a child in a farm family. My parents didn't know any better either, because to survive on the farm, you have to be tough. And so they passed that down to me, this highly sensitive person. And I didn't know how to, number one, ask for help. Number two, how to be kind to myself and say, maybe a little rest would be good for you. And in my mind, the idea of being weak or not being strong or capable was like the worst sin you could commit. So
Mhm.
because of all that, I felt like I had to show up, and I couldn't complain, and I couldn't say I need a little time or I'm having a fever. And I worked right through that. Like I just worked right through until within 6 months of me finishing that chemo, I think I passed out one night. I was admitted that night by the resident on call, and I had an abscess. And then of course, went to surgery, drained the abscess. I get out of that surgery in the morning, and the surgeon's like, Jill, you have Crohn's disease.
Goodness
Oh, my
gracious,
word.
Jill. Oh,
Wow.
goodness. Thank you for sharing that. I just, it pains me that I didn't know you were going through all of this at the time. But as you said, medical school, that environment, we're trained to put on a strong, I'm okay, I've got this kind of attitude. And like you, I'm an HSP, a highly sensitive person. I didn't realize it until one of my best friends is a psychotherapist. I met her in 2010, and that was a revelation to me, just what a gift it is to be highly sensitive, but also just some unique challenges. And then you enter in the really harsh training environment of medical school, plus being a woman and feeling like you have something to prove as well. So goodness, I'm so sorry that you went through all of that, and I didn't realize that. That's just I actually, after I read your book, I want to read you this quote that it popped into my head that I think just encapsulates you and your experiences, from Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And she said that the most beautiful people we have known are those who have known defeat, known suffering, known struggle, known loss, and have found their way out of the depths. These persons have an appreciation, a sensitivity, and an understanding of life that fills them with compassion, gentleness, and a deep, loving concern. Beautiful people do not just happen. And so I think that just perfectly describes you. And thank you for sharing your journey. And you did an amazing job of sharing a whole lot in a short period of time, but it doesn't even scratch the surface of what you share in your book. I was so intrigued to learn about your background growing up on a farm in the Midwest. I too grew up in the Midwest in a rural area. And it is very clear to me that you were destined to become a doctor after struggling so much with your health, even as a child, with the severe allergies and the environmental toxin exposure, the pesticide exposure that you had on the farm, and as you share in the book, even in utero. So I'm just curious if you want to share a little bit more about your early years and what inspired you to become a functional medicine doctor.
Sure. And thank you for that beautiful quote. I'm deeply touched. You almost brought me to tears, but I also do believe, like, if we can take that view of suffering, because I always say we're either just going through something, we just finished it, or we're in the midst of something, or we're going to right around the
That's
bend
right.
something. So we're not immune. None of us, I'm not unique to be immune to suffering, but it really is the lens at which we look at that, because God always has purpose. This is going to choke me up, because he always has the most beautiful. The times when I have felt the most close to God were in the deepest suffering. And there are times in my life when it's going well that I look back at the most awful, difficult, painful times, and I long for that closeness to God, because that's where he shows up the most. And
Mhm.
so there's so much beauty in that. And I just want to share, because all of your listeners are human, right? And so that means we're in this race called, well, maybe there's new dogs or cats or whatever. But the truth is, like, it's so common. And so often we isolate ourselves by thinking we're the only ones going through this divorce or this illness or this difficulty with our careers or this stress of a boss or a employee or whatever it is. And I could name 1,000 other things, financial difficulties. But if you're out there, you know that's reality, right? And the thing is, we somehow think that, like, when we're in that we're alone. And the truth is, number one, we have a God that is so good and with us and so close to us in the difficult times. But number two, it is so common. And when we start to realize that those places are the most precious places of connection to the divine, I long, in fact, now I'm finally at the place where I hope I don't have to suffer more. I don't like it. Like, it's not fun, but I'm also so convinced this is, to me, the definition of resilience. It's, I know no matter what comes, that not one thing that I could think of, including death, I'm not afraid of those things anymore, because I know I have a God that is so close in those times, and even closer and even more good. And like, the times when I see the faithfulness of God's presence in my life are always in the hard times. And even more than that is the times when I experience personally the deepest transformation, understanding, and even joy, right? Like, sometimes the deepest joy is there, because you're like, and if, when we start to frame that, then suffering comes, and instead of being like, why me, what's going on, we're like, oh, thank you, God, what in this suffering, in this experience, is what you want me to learn and grow, and how can I find the beauty in this? Because there always is a beautiful silver lining in those things, and it doesn't mean it's not, it doesn't mean it's fun, but it's beautiful. So thanks for letting me share that. Back to the farm. So I grew up on this farm, and part of the journey there was, I mean, my family just did typical farming, corn and soybeans in central Illinois. And thank goodness, because of my cancer, and I don't think I mentioned in the book, but my sister at 28, so I was 25 breast cancer, which is endocrine tissue, right? At 28, my sister, who's 7 years younger than me, got thyroid cancer.
Oh,
So
God.
two girls, same farm and same environment, same genetics. There was definitely a piece of the puzzle that was probably endocrine disrupting chemicals, and things that maybe many of your listeners know, and maybe they don't, is things like pesticides, herbicides, glyphosate, chemicals on the farm, many of which are endocrine disrupting, which means they act like hormones on the body. So, like, for example, for me, I do believe my mother probably our well water had runoff, and who knows where else was a source. But I actually believe that my mother probably had in her body some of the toxic chemicals, and then in utero. And the year that we were, I think, breast cancer, 2001, there's a study that came out in Canada and tested the cord blood of baby infants, and they found 200 plus chemicals. Now, this is over 20 years old, so it's only getting worse. But at that time, 20 years ago, they found that babies being born into the world were already toxic with certain levels of chemicals. And like I said, I think for me, it probably started in utero. If you think about a cancer at 25, those cells started to go rogue and bad probably when I was 5 or 10, like way younger. And so the insults could have been in utero, and then in my youth. And of course, we played in creeks and we were out on the farm. But what I was going to say about my family, because of my sister and I, they have actually gone to 100% non-GMO crops now, and partially organic, which I'm so proud of them for kind of changing
Yes,
the way
that's
farming is practiced.
fantastic.
Yeah, that's inspiring me to investigate a little bit more. I have 3 children, and we are on a farm and in a farm community, and we grow our own food, which we can have some level of control over. But yeah, such great awareness for people out there to be mindful of potential toxin exposure. And I want to comment too. I've been in Psalm 34 this week, and one of my favorite verses out of that psalm is how the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. And I think that speaks so beautifully to what you were sharing about your perspective on suffering and the opportunity for the Lord to draw near to us as we draw near to him and experience him as our comforter in the hard times. So, yeah.
Love that. And it's so true, right?
It is. Well, Dr. Jill, I would love to hear more about the mold exposure illness that you experienced, I believe from a flood in your office building. And I know that mold illness is a lesser known condition. So can you shed a little light on what it actually is and how it affected your health and how functional medicine contributed to your recovery from mold illness?
Yeah, you bet. So again, I always joke I would never choose to treat mold related illness, but God had other plans. Okay, this is lesson number 34, and we're going to learn about this. Right. So what happened is in Boulder 2013, there was this massive flood. And sadly, like lately, there's been even more and more floods all over the US. And it was called the 1,000-year flood. And it was literally millions, if not even, I think it was almost on $1 billion of damage and massive, massive flooding. My office had already been, it was an older 1970s building, and there had been a little water damage in the basement. And but this flood really caused more issues. And later I found my office was on a second floor built over a crawl space that was unfinished with standing water. And all these things in hindsight are mold reservoirs. And so that right after that flood, about a year later, I started having really significant fatigue, rashes, brain fog, immune deficiency issues. And I could go on and on. The most common symptoms of mold related illness can masquerade as other things. In fact, Dr. Dale Bredesen, who teaches on Alzheimer's and reversing Alzheimer's, he's been quoted as saying 1/3 of young Alzheimer's patients are mold related. So it actually masquerades as Alzheimer's or masquerades as cognitive changes, mood disorders, autoimmunity, multiple sclerosis. And it isn't that we don't really have these immune processes going on, but mold just happens to be this massive toxic trigger that can take someone into autoimmunity or brain dysfunction. So I didn't know any of this, but I knew I wasn't feeling well. And I had recovered from breast cancer, Crohn's, and went on to be pretty healthy. I moved to Colorado in 2010. So this was 3.5, 4 years after I moved out here. Was doing well until the mold hit. And then I started going downhill. And then I had to figure out what was going on. So finally, I was in a bit of denial because I thought, well, maybe there's something in the environment. I always felt worse at work than home, but I didn't really know. And then finally, it got bad enough to where I found an inspector. We went down the basement. We found bulk Stachybotrys, which is a very toxic black mold. And I did some urine testing, which was very new at that time. And there was like, okay, is this valid or not? What it does is it checks the metabolites of mold in your urine. So clearly, if you had an exposure, and what happens with exposure is mold can be like behind the wall, maybe kind of stuck in a dark corner, not necessarily that the spores are out in your air, but most mold produce mycotoxins, and mycotoxins are VOCs, they're volatile organic compounds that are 2.5 microns or smaller, so about the same size as viruses. So they can go right through the wall, they can go right through materials, they can get into our air. And when we breathe the mycotoxins, they can go right through the alveoli into the bloodstream within seconds of breathing that air. So spores typically don't go into our lungs, they're too big. And so you can have spores be an issue, but the spores aren't the really toxic thing. It's the toxins, they're called mycotoxins that are produced by the mold that get into the air quality that can cause damage. And we have thousands of studies on mycotoxins. It's funny because livestock, like farmers with, hogs and cattle and different things, they were the ones that originally studied mycotoxins because a lot of the grain supply would be contaminated, and then their cattle would start to die or have stomach issues, and they'd have to learn, what do we do about the mold? And so a lot of our early studies came from animals because the farm animals that had contaminated grains would be getting sick, and they learned what would happen. Now, of course, we know it can happen to humans too. So backstory for me is I got really, really sick, didn't know what it was, found it was mold. And the day I found out the toxins and the sample from the basement were the same toxin, like one was Stachybotrys and one was the toxin Stachy produces. So it was pretty clear it was connected. I left the office and I kind of had to start over. And what we now know is some of those mycotoxins that mold produces can impermeate porous materials, clothing, which you can wash, but books and paper are especially porous to those toxins. So I literally left my whole library of medical school books at that office and started over. And the next 18 months, yeah, that was hard.
I'm sure. I can only imagine. I'm a bibliophile.
Me too.
Myself,
Me too.
and I know
I always joke
your
before
collection.
medicine, I thought I was gonna be a librarian because I love books so much. So like books, I love books. So yes, exactly. But then I had to really learn how to get well. And what I learned is there's about a quarter of the population that isn't able to tag these antigens. They're just like any antigen that could be toxic to our bodies, chemicals or a food allergy or whatever else. And for some people like myself, we have a harder time tagging and eliminating those antigens, those toxins from our bodies. So we accumulate them in our tissues and start to get more ill from those effects. And like I was saying earlier, we've studied trichosathenes and aflatoxins and ochratoxins, which are all the chemical compounds that mycotoxins produced by mold. And I mean, if you see the range of these, and it's all data driven, there's anything from carcinogenic to liver toxic to nephrotoxic to neurotoxic to immune suppressive. You can almost name the issue and they can probably cause that. So they're very, very toxic. And in order to get well, which is, again, I had to learn to get well myself, you basically have to just support your biotransformation, which is like your liver gallbladder axis, and allow your tissues to release these toxins. I call it mobilization. And that can be done like infrared sauna. We know that whether it's PCBs or mold toxins or metals or chemicals, a lot of times when we sweat, that brings it out of our tissues, and then it can get into the bloodstream where the liver or the kidneys can filter it. So you have to mobilize these toxins out of tissues if they've been stored. And again, infrared sauna, Epsom salt baths, glutathione or any precursors of glutathione will start to move these, and then you have to excrete it. And the main area this happens is liver gallbladder. So your liver takes that blood and filters it, phase 1, phase 2, and spits it out as a water-soluble toxin, and it's no longer as toxic, into the gallbladder. And then the gallbladder secretes, drips the bile into the small bowel. And this is why binders like clay and charcoal and chlorella and these kinds of things we use will actually, they're bile acid binders, and some of them have an electrostatic charge for certain toxins like metals or chemicals or things. And so adding in an inert binder to the protocol can help pull that bile that's contaminated with the toxins out of our system in our stool. And so typically enhancing glutathione, doing the mobilization, so it's infrared sauna or Epsom salt baths or movement or walking or sweating, all those things start to move the toxins, and then supporting the liver with glutathione, liver support, and binders is kind of how you start to decrease that load. And for me, it's pretty common for patients as well. That process took like 12 to 18 months, just slowly, steadily. One thing we see nowadays that I had as well, because these toxins are very potent immune triggers, you can see mast cell activation, which is basically this like hives or itching or brain fog or permeability in the gut. And a lot of people have these kind of like immune histamine kind of reactions. And often when they're either exposed to mold or going through the mold detox, the mast cells get more angry. And so they'll be experiencing these reactions or these rashes or this brain fog or a more permeable gut where all of a sudden they're allergic to 7 new foods. And those kinds of things all kind of go together because the mold is, it's a really nasty thing. And whether it's getting in your tissues or getting out of your body, it can be quite a process.
Yes.
Wow.
And they didn't teach us that in medical school, did they?
Not at all. I had to relearn. I'm like, right, exactly.
And sadly, it's something that conventional doctors aren't yet, aware of this, whole phenomenon. I actually was directing a patient to your website today, a lovely woman in her 60s who had suffered with eczema as an adult, a new finding for years. And we were trying to dig into the root causes. And I finally suggested a mycotoxin urine test. Lo and behold, she was quite toxic, and a home inspection revealed lots of mold in her crawl space. She came back, she was showing me her skin, it was all clear, and she had moved out, of her home for 20 years. That was quite a, a traumatic process, just like you experienced with your office building. But it was just so incredible. And I was directing her to the website because she was wanting to do a sauna, and I'm like, I know Dr. Jill has a good protocol and has some information there. So thanks for sharing. You just have had all the learning lessons with the hard diseases, the cancer, autoimmunity, and mold, all the things that triggered the complex chronic illness that so many of our patients and us deal with. So thanks for sharing that, Jill.
Welcome.
Your book title highlights resilience. Can you tell us how you personally cultivated resilience throughout your health challenges, and how did faith and functional medicine intertwine in that journey?
Yes. And I love that I get to talk about my faith here so much. We're talking some platforms, I'd be a little more careful. And here I'm like, I can't wait to talk to you girls because it is just the foundation. I mean, literally, I have a ring on my ring finger that is a very small local band. And this is my commitment to God. Like, this is literally like, I feel like, I mean, whether you call it, I feel like this may sound weird, but it's my way of just like knowing that is my ultimate love. Is
Mhm.
I feel like married, my God is my husband. And in the scripture, there is, he is your maker and your husband. And this is my commitment to him above all else, all humans and everything else in my life. And part of that comes, I say that around resilience, because I talk about functional medicine, science, and faith. And the deal is, I grew up, again, with a very stoic, hardworking German Swiss family. And so I learned to be hardworking and all that stuff. And I learned to be very analytical. And even med school, I did bioengineering at undergrad and then med school. So very, very left brain analytical. And then as I've been in this journey of life and God's opened my heart and mind, he's given me a lot more openness to the Holy Spirit. And we could in the world call that intuition, but truly it's God's spirit within me. And that's this right brain creative. It doesn't always make sense. And often God speaks in images or sounds or feelings or pictures, and not in a X plus Y equals Z, right? Like that's not usually how God's speaking. So when I talk about science and faith or left brain, right brain, to me, they're all kind of ways of integrating. He's given us this great brain, and this is what we're using to help diagnose and treat and help patients. And even solving my problems, I've used a lot of the analytical, the science kind of part. But what God's expanded in me, and even the masculine, feminine, he created male and female, and we're different. And each of us has some of those characteristics. Like if I look back, I was a much more masculine driven, kind of like suppressing the sensitive female nature. And then but again, God's like, no, I created you as female, and with your sensitivities, you and I, Cynthia, and like these things are actually gifts and not liabilities. And so as we combine all that God has given us, the masculine parts of ourselves, the feminine, the science, which is good, we need that background, but the faith, and then the left brain, the right brain, to me, they're all like one. And it's like God's perfect how he manifests in our life. And even when we're with patients, what I learned is I can look at the labs and make all the data points and all that kind of stuff, but the magic happens when I trust God to guide my spirit, and I'm listening, and he'll just guide and be like, go in this direction, ask this question. And often it doesn't make sense when we're in God's spirit, and when we're in the right brain, we're in that space. And again, I can parallel to the feminine nature. It's all one, but because God is one, but it's like those pieces actually have given me the most breakthroughs in my own health and the most insight into my patients. And in medical school, we're taught not to trust that, right? We're not to trust faith. We're certainly not to trust the Holy Spirit or intuition. But the bringing this out in the book and even talking now is there is so much power there, because as we, instead of thinking that we have to have all the answers and relying on our wisdom and our brains, I think of our brains as the old analog computers where we did like the Oregon Trail in, grade school, right?
That game.
Remember that?
I love
Like
that.
it was like you had to type in things like the dot, like I don't even remember how, but like that. And now like we have the supercomputer, which is God's spirit within us, that is millions of pieces of data in seconds if we take our brain aside and we actually trust. And again, that wisdom comes in a still small voice, which is not usually even verbal words. It's a feeling, it's a sense. It might be like, those times when you're like, I need to call so-and-so, and you text them and say, hey, I'm praying for you. And like, how did you know? But that's God knew in his spirit. And I find every day in clinic when I'm in that place, and I call it magic. It's not magic, but that's where the magic happens. That's where the profound miracles happen, is when we're in that space of just relying completely on his spirit. And our left brain is always the judge. It's always the one to be like, well, you don't know this, or how do you know that, or where did that come from, or questioning, right? And that's how it's like, shut up, let me trust your spirit. And as I've learned to integrate, that's where, and when you talk about resilience, the most powerful stuff in my own life has been when I believe about what is possible through Jesus Christ and through God's power in my life. And no one will tell me that's possible. No one says it's logical. No one says but I believe in the impossible. I believe in the miracles. And I have seen thousands of miracles in my life because I believe that God's ability to restore health, restore healing, and do the unexpected in our lives is beyond anything we can think or dream or imagine. And he says that in his word, but it's even more important because, especially as scientists, as doctors, we get stuck in the world's view of what's possible. And the resilience comes in really believing and trusting that God has given us everything we need inside our bodies and with relationships and his spirit that we need to accomplish his work in the world. And I have a little chapter called Believe, Act, Wait. And as I was writing, I couldn't have even told you what my little formula was, but as God revealed it as I was writing, I was like, oh, this is it over and over. What it is you believe. And the belief has to be, not has to be, but it could be in something that seems totally illogical. That's where the faith comes in. And the belief is there. And you're like, God, I believe this is possible. I believe I can heal from breast cancer. And then you act, you do what God has given you to do in the world, whether you give a patient a medicine or an herb or a supplement, or you encourage them, or you call a friend, or you take another course, you act and you do it within the box of what's possible and doable for you. And then you wait, and the magic happens when God shows up with all the things that you can't. And when your limitations are here, and God's like, no, I want to give you this much. And then I just literally over and over, I'm like, wow, God, you are amazing. And now I've seen it enough that that's my definition of resilience is believing, acting, and waiting, and seeing the things that God can accomplish through a willing, faithful person that believes in miracles.
Wow.
Oh, so good.
Yeah.
It's just amazing how you so eloquently articulated, these same things that has taken me 20 years to come to as well and discover. And I love in your book, when was it your therapist that said you can be a badass and a highly sensitive, delicate flower. And that's me too. So talk about, shedding those limiting beliefs. I love it. Such rich wisdom that you've shared with us. Dr. Jill, I know I could just keep you here all evening with lots of different topics, but we'll go ahead and wrap up. I did want to highlight, though, not only are you a superstar functional medicine expert, but you're now an executive producer, film writer, and you're featured in a new documentary about your just health journey. And I would love for you to share a little bit about that. I don't know about that. What's it called and when do we get to watch it?
So this is a total God thing. You talk about miracles. So I had been writing my book, and I was in the middle of the final editing stages, and 2001 came along right in the midst of the pandemic, right? We're all kind of stuck at home. And I was just literally praying in my prayer chair where I sit in the mornings, January 1st, 2021. And my thought, and this is all God's spirit within me, it was like, wow, people, I think more than ever are on screens. They're watching Netflix, they're stuck at home, and they've switched to, maybe people still read, but a lot more people are on screens. And I thought, gosh, if I really want to reach the world with a message of hope and inspiration and faith, I need to be on screens. And Cindy, I don't have any clue what I'm doing. I've never produced a movie, right? But I do have a really big faith and an amazing God. And I was like, well, why not do a documentary? Like, love it. Why not? And then and here's what God always does. If he puts an idea in my heart, I just start walking forward. It's the believe, act, and doing the act part. So I'm making calls and just assuming if God wants to do this, you show. And it's funny because this happened way back with the book. I didn't tell you this story, but 7 years before I started writing the book, this was 2012. So almost over a decade ago, I was in a time, I was reading The Circle Maker by Mark, I don't remember the name of the author, but Circle Maker is the name of the book. And it was all about praying big circles around things that are big dreams that only God can accomplish. And he put on my heart, write a book. I was just arguing with God. I said, God, who am I? I don't know what I can't write a book, and I don't know what to say. And what if it never sales? And what if no one reads it? And all that silliness that we get into, right? And God just clearly put on my heart. He said, Jill, all you have to do is tell your story. I have given you a story, and I've healed you for a purpose. And all you have to do is tell your story. He said, I will get you a publisher. I will get you. He said, leave that all to me. And again, it wasn't like a voice, but I just knew in my spirit that God was like, all you have to do is do this little part, the act part that I have given you. Everything else will be taken care of. And I remember holding that little piece in my heart for, I don't know, 5 or 6 years before I started writing. And he is so faithful. He brought a publisher. He brought like all the pieces that I needed. And every time that I would get in my own strength and feel like I'm not enough, right? I would just remember, no, God, you promised. I would actually joke all the time, like, God, you promised to bring the publisher. It's your marketing. It's your reputation. Like, I'm literally like, hey, God, I'm done my part. You got to market this book. You got to get it out there. And you know what? He's so faithful, and he does it in a way that we don't expect. And it's way better than we expect. But if we have a little box idea of what his possibilities are, he gives us much bigger. And it's not in the timeline we think, because I didn't think it would take me 7-8 years to write and then 10 years to publish. I had no idea. But that backstory is important, because when this movie idea came, I was like, God, if this is your idea, you're going to have to show up. And within 1 week, I had producer, director, executive assistant. I had a whole team that was like, we love this idea. Let's do this. And then as they got in the project, they read my book, my draft, which was a draft back then. And like, Jill, we have to tell your story. Like, so I was like, well, okay, I'll do that. And then, and we talked about patience too in the documentary. And then here's the amazing miracle. I said, well, guys, producer, director, they've done this, right? I said, what do you need for a budget? And it was close to $1 million. So I thought, well, let's write up the budget. And I'm like, well, you know, God, if you want this to happen, we're going to get an investor or whatever. And again, it's better that you don't know anything. You just trust God for these things. Because like I've talked to all kinds of documentary filmmakers now, like, Jill, no one gets $1 million budget in their first documentary. Wow. Right? So, but here's what happened. I'm like 2 months later on the phone with this beautiful, beautiful investor who actually wanted to buy my clinic. And as we talked it and everything, I realized, oh, he's very, very wealthy and he loves functional medicine, and God put in my heart, share the documentary. So I told him about it and I said, if you'd be interested, you know, he said, I'll fly out in 2 weeks and let's talk. Wow. And within a month, he's like, I would love to be the sole investor. Here's the money for the film. I believe in your project. And within 3 months of that idea, God gave us the money in whole with one investor to do the filming and do the movie. So again, that's
me chills. I love it.
God can do that, because here I am, like literally that January 1st, I'm like, well, who am I? But well, God, if you want to do it, I'll show up. And it just shows that believe act way, because I did believe it's possible. And I never doubted once that idea came that if God wanted it to happen, he would provide the money. And he did. He laid it right in our laps. So then we filmed from that year until the end of 2022. And now we have a full feature documentary that I feel like is very impactful. It's called Dr. Patient. And if anyone see the trailer, it's at drpatientmovie.com. And you can watch the trailer. And so as far as where it's going, it's in film festivals now. We're in Manhattan and we're going to be in Richmond soon. And then, and in the film festival, it's not really public yet, but as we get a distribution, if you want to know, you can go to that website and sign up for when it's going to play in your area, because our hope is either it'll go straight to streaming or it might be in theaters for a short period of time. And honestly, this is another God thing. We don't know what'll happen, but I know God will do his part.
Oh, Jill, congratulations. I'm just so thrilled for you. And just what an amazing story to get out there to the world, just to open people's minds to, you know, the whole environmental role of toxicity and illness and just, you know, the different way of thinking about health that is available to us in integrative holistic functional medicine. So I'm thrilled for your mission, and I'm just very grateful of the time that you've spent with us here today. It's just been wonderful to reconnect with you. And one last thing, given our audience is made up of mainly women, many of whom are in the field of healthcare or ministry, many of us have the intersection of those two things. Do you have any final thoughts you want to share to encourage our listeners, particularly those who may be going through their own health struggles, trying to balance that with all the things, you know, demanding careers and ministries? So just give us your top tips for cultivating resilience.
Yeah, so I'm going to share the one thing that has transformed my life the most in health. And I grew up in this culture, very conservative, fundamental Christian, beautiful culture, like so supportive. My family was so loving. My parents have been married over 50 years, and all of my siblings are married with multiple children and all Christians. So amazing, amazing family. But in that culture, there was also something that I had to kind of unlearn. And it was like, deny yourself, put aside yourself, which again is Christ-like, right? But to such an extent, I did that it literally, like when I had Crohn's and some of these illnesses, I hated my body for betraying me. Like I actually hated my own self. And with autoimmune, metaphorically, it's attack of self. And one of the things I had to learn was within that Christian culture, like how to love myself as God would see me. And I feel like that's such a hard thing in the Christian culture to talk about. And yes, it's so important in a really healthy way. And I now know God wants me to love who he created, which is my own body, right? And I think it's hard because women were taught to serve and love and give. And that's all so beautiful and so Christ-like. But we have to actually take care of the body God's given us. And we have to actually, number one, trust that spirit within us to tell us when this is too hot, too cold, too much, too wrong food, wrong sleep, like wrong relationships, because we can often like put that aside when we're serving and loving others, and we lose touch with the intuition and God's spirit within us that's telling us the way to walk, right? But we can't really love what God has given us in this body unless we trust his spirit within us to guide us. And that peace is what I most want to give to women like myself, because we've been, most of us, denying ourselves and serving everybody else, which again is so lovely and so Christ-like, but we still have to take care of these bodies God has given us. And part of that is trusting that we do know, even as a doctor, that I know maybe better than my doctor, what's good for me. Like what kind of food and what kind of air and what kind of water and what kind of sleep and what kind of inputs and what kind of medicines. And so often we relegate that decision outside of ourselves to the doctor or to someone else, but God has given us that wisdom. And I always just want to encourage women, number one, love yourself as Christ loves you, like he sees you as perfect. And when we're in Christ, like those messages that we're not enough, we're not good enough, that we have to deny our own needs like we did in medical school, those lead to illness. And so kind of re-engaging in that place, in a really healthy place that honors Christ, is so important, because like I said, the culture I grew up in, and maybe the message was there and I just missed it, but I learned to really like hate myself, deny myself in a sense that was super harmful to my body and my physical health. So having that, like, it's okay to love what God has created, and that's our bodies, right? And it's hard to talk about, I think, in some Christian cultures because we're so into,
Yeah. So beautiful, deep wisdom, and near and dear to my own heart. I named my practice Caring for the Body, PLLC.
Oh my goodness, beautiful. Yes,
because
yes.
God has me on the same lesson plan of, really just kind of recovering my own health after the harsh training and all the programming that we get from the medical system, that we have to deny our needs as physicians and healers. So we're on the same lesson plan. Beautiful. And thank you for so beautifully articulating that, Jill.
You're welcome.
I know so many of our listeners are just gonna, I think, even experience some soul healing from just hearing your story, and even being reminded of the importance of believing in what's possible and putting our faith to work, and not losing sight of dreams and hopes and the possibility that only God can actually produce in our lives. So that's, I often say it's God's super on our natural. We have our natural, skills, abilities, and limitations, but he's limitless, and so his super on our natural, we can do a lot with that. So, well, this has been such an amazing conversation. And Dr. Jill, we want our listeners to know how they can find you and connect with you.
Yeah, so my website is just jillcarnahan.com, and I've got loads and loads of decades of free blogs and resources and podcasts there. And then social media is a great place where I like to just share stuff too. And I'm on Instagram as just Dr. Jill Carnahan there.
Okay. Thank you so much. Blessings to you, Dr. Jill. So appreciate you being here.
You're welcome. Such a pleasure to be with you both today.